Go on, you start.
So in this section, we wanted to look at different types of relationships you might have with someone who's got dementia, and also around mental capacity and promoting independence. And did you want to start off by talking about the different types of relationships?
Yeah, so we want to be very inclusive in this bit, to talk about relationships with parents, partners, family and friends, but also LGBT relationships, so that we're not ruling anybody out. So feel included if we're talking about you. So what we wanted to talk about really was that when you get a diagnosis of dementia, things will change, and over time they'll change more and more. Things will increase in terms of what changes you'll see. But at first, especially in the early days, there won't be many changes. But you will pick up as a carer on things that are happening around you, and things that you think about. And I think I would really clearly say, don't think that person isn't still that person. It's really important to think it's still your mum, it's still your dad, it's still your partner. This is still the person that you love, and always will be. Even when, like with my mum in her last year, can't remember your name, but she did used to say that I was very important, but she didn't know who I was. Which obviously I am important.
And I think one of the difficulties can be, particularly as the dementia may progress, is the dynamic in the relationship may change. So particularly if you're the child, so if you're looking after your parent, and they will have seen you as their child, and I think we always tend to think of our children as a child, and we looked after them and we nurtured them and we were the caregivers for them to then suddenly be our caregivers, can sometimes take some adjusting to, and sometimes those transitions can be difficult. Similarly, if it's a partner or a friend, you may have been peers, and then suddenly over time they're more dependent on you. And again, it's just recognising that as those relationships change, there may be difficulties, there may be tensions, and you can work through it. But that starting point is that they're still that same person.
Yeah, and I think also that people need to be quite mindful of not taking over for the person as well. That it's not their responsibility always to make decisions. And we talked earlier a little bit about the Mental Capacity Act and the Mental Health Act, but also considering that people may make decisions and they may not be the decisions that you thought they should be making, but that if they have capacity, that is their right. And it's always important to consider that that person has the right to make decisions even if you don't agree with them, if they have capacity. And
it might be worth us just giving a quick overview of the mental health capacity.
Well, what we tend to do when we're looking at somebody's capacity is it's about the decision that they are about to make in that time. So capacity can change over time. So it's one question that you ask somebody. So certainly in hospital we might ask, do they use the buzzer to call a nurse? So are they actually cognizant of the fact that they have to use a buzzer to call a nurse? And if they don't know what a buzzer is and they can't call a nurse, then we're saying that they lack capacity to make a decision to use a buzzer to call a nurse. That is their capacity. So capacity is about a decision. It's one decision. So you can't make it for all decisions that somebody makes.
And that's really important, that the starting point is that people have the capacity to make important decisions about their own life, unless it's determined otherwise, and that can change over time. And just because someone may not have the capacity to do one thing, so they may not be able, for instance, to manage their finances or their money, but that doesn't mean that they lose capacity in other areas. And just being mindful of that, and certainly any health professionals you deal with will probably be aware of the legislation, and there should be regular assessments and checking in on what someone's capacity is and it isn't.
And even when somebody doesn't necessarily have capacity, it doesn't mean that they shouldn't be included in decisions. Often that can happen, so people are suddenly not in charge of their lives anymore, and they can feel as though everything is out of their control, which can be really difficult. So for example, my father had dementia and was also blind in one eye and drove, and all of us wanted him to stop driving. The GP had determined that he had the capacity to make the decision whether he should or shouldn't drive, and therefore it was impossible for us to stop him driving, and we spent 2 years trying to persuade him not to drive, contacting the DVLA, contacting all sorts of people trying to stop him from driving. All I could imagine was ending up in court with a child who he'd driven into, with the family saying, "Why didn't you stop him?" And it was very difficult. It was a difficult situation. It often can be, because driving is something people don't like to give up. In the end, I phoned the insurance company and told them that he could no longer see at a distance and therefore he shouldn't be driving. And he was stopped, but he was furious about that. And those things are really difficult. They're really difficult things to talk about when he's your dad. He taught me to drive, and there I am saying that he kept saying, "I taught you to drive. How come you can tell me whether or not I can drive or not?" So it was a really difficult conversation to have with him all the time. And like I said, it went on for 2 years. And during that time, he bashed his car 5 times into various things, including people on the other side of the road.
And that's one of the difficult aspects around people's capacity, is that we have the right as adults to make decisions that other people may disagree with, even around our health. People may choose to smoke, may choose to drink excessively, may choose to have ice cream for breakfast. We may not particularly support those decisions, but those people have the right to make those decisions, and that can be particularly difficult.
And that comes into part of what we wanted to talk about here, about arguing with people with dementia. Mum had a great last year where she definitely decided that she'd played Rafael Nadal on Wimbledon centre court, and she lost. She did tell me she'd lost. But when she watched Wimbledon, she said, "Oh yes, I played tennis there." So I said, "Oh yeah, who did you play?" And she said, "Rafael Nadal." So I was like, "Oh right, what happened?" And she said she'd lost. She told me that she'd been fishing in the Yemen when she saw the film Fly Fishing in the Yemen. She had also done the Tour de France, apparently. She'd never ridden a bike in her life, but she told me that she'd done the Tour de France. Should I at that point have said, "No, you haven't, Mum, you've never ridden a bike in your life"? I didn't, because for me, those were beautiful things that she was thinking. And the idea that she was dying thinking, "Do you know, I've done the Tour de France, I've played at Wimbledon, I've done all these things," it would have been completely counterproductive for me to tell her that that wasn't true and it was in her mind. So I think a lot of the time, arguing with someone who's got a fixed idea of what they've done and what they haven't done is quite counterproductive. It's better to change the subject, or to try and navigate them into something else. Like when they start on a subject, because they can get quite obsessed about it, you just say, "Actually, let's go out to the garden," or "Shall we go for a drive?" or "Let's go to the supermarket," or do something different and change the topic. My stepmother is very difficult in that respect, because she has certain topics where she will constantly say, "This has happened" or "That's happened," and she can often get into arguments with people where they're saying, "No, that hasn't happened," and actually it's not very effective.
And one of the really difficult areas that this can be a particular problem is if people have had relatives or loved ones that have died. So if, for instance, you're looking after someone with dementia, let's say their partner's died, and they will then start asking for their partner, or ask where their partner is, or asking, when am I going to see them next? And some people face a real dilemma around that, because it's, do you tell the person that they've died, and then that makes them very upset and agitated, and it may be in a couple of hours they ask the same question again and they go through the grief over and over again? Or do you lie to the person? And a lot of people feel very strongly that actually you shouldn't lie to someone, because that's kind of caring for them unethically. Or do you try and change the subject? But again, if people are very fixated on, well, where's my wife, where's my husband, where's my son, where's my daughter, they may not be able to be diverted off that topic of conversation.
So we're just talking about arguing with people if they say that their wife's still alive, for example, when their wife's been dead for 4 or 5 years. And my view would be, change the subject, try and do something else, distract someone from that particular topic, because people with dementia can often get into a vein where they're constantly on one track, and it's about getting them off that track.
And when we say arguing, it might be something as simple as someone just says, "Oh well, where's my husband?" and their husband's died, and it's difficult because there are some people who think, well, the kindest thing to do is just to lie to them, and so they've just gone out to the shops, they'll be back later thinking they won't remember. But a lot of people find that very unethical, that you're lying to someone you're caring about. Equally, if you tell them that they've died, they may be experiencing that grief and loss several times a day, and they'll forget that they know they've died, and they will ask again and they'll ask again. In fact, I think we were talking to a nurse who had an interesting strategy of dealing with this, where they were caring for someone whose husband had died. So they died recently, so they actually took them to the funeral home so they could see the person's dead body lying there, and said, look, this is them, they've died, you can see it, and actually wrote a note so that the person had it in their room that said, this person's died, as a way of anchoring them into that reality. But it's a very difficult one, and especially if you're caring for someone and you see them go through the grief and loss of losing someone, and they're doing that multiple times, as well as being obviously distressing to them, it can be really distressing to you as a carer.
Yeah, I tend to think that arguing people out of some of the tracks that they get into, so people can get into a track where they're believing that such a thing has happened and will go over it and over it and over it. And you can get into fights if you're caring for someone where you're saying, no, that hasn't happened, or no, that's not right, or no, that's not true. Firstly, it puts you in a position where you're contradicting someone constantly, and it alters your relationship. And secondly, you can constantly go over that again, and it's a waste of time for both you and them, and it's exhausting if you're the carer. And certainly, my stepmother can go over things a lot, and she can say something's happened which hasn't, and she's got particular fascinations for how many roses she wants in her garden, and her daughter doesn't want her to plant any more roses because they need uptake, and she can't do the uptake, but she's sure she can. So she's sure that she can do the uptake, she's sure she can look after the roses, and she can't. Physically she can't. So she's constantly asking people to plant roses for her, and it can be very frustrating. So the best thing to do in those circumstances is to say, let's go out and look at the roses, or let's go out and look at the garden, or let's go and look at a book on roses, or let's do something else, and not have that conversation, because that's the conversation which ends up with fighting, and it does end up with fighting.
And the fighting can take a huge toll on the carer themselves. And the other thing about revisiting painful memories is if it's a family member, a relative, you'll be revisiting some of those memories yourself. So if their person's husband or wife has died, that could be one of your parents, and having to revisit that over and over again can also be really difficult. But the key starting point around mental capacity is that person has the right to make their own decisions until it can be determined that they can't make those decisions in the best interest, and there are safeguards around that as well, and particularly when that comes to decisions about where they live, whether or not they go into a care home, major financial decisions, and that's really important.
It is really important, but I also think it's important, even without capacity, to include people in the decision about care homes, as much as is possible. So again, with Mum, I took her to several care homes to see around them. She generally had to drink half a bottle of wine when she'd been in one, because she didn't want to go there, thank you very much. And one of them, she had a PhD, one of them said, oh, you like reading, got a lovely section of Mills and Boons, and Mum was looking at me going... So I just think it's important to get the right place for the right person as well. And in the end, to respect the fact that they're an individual. Everybody's different. We're making quite general statements here, but just remember that everybody's different. There'll be different tactics that you use for different people and different strategies to cope.
And I remember someone making a really interesting point where they were talking about people who may lack legal capacity, may lack mental capacity, and they said, well, think about how people often deal with children. Now, it might be a child may not have the legal capacity to make certain decisions, but that doesn't mean you exclude them from it. And it may be that they may not have the full autonomy because of their age, but you still wouldn't just unilaterally make a decision and impose it on a child. You would still involve them in the process, because you're still recognising who that person is, and as much autonomy as they can have.
Yeah, and it can be incredibly upsetting for people who have been used to being in control of their lives all their lives, to suddenly have some of those things taken away or not to be included. My dad constantly used to ask, what's the plan? What's the plan? What's the plan? because he wanted to know, because he wanted a defined thing that we had decided together. And even when he forgot the plan, it was that we decided this, Dad, this was the plan. Once he said this was the plan, then he was fine.